Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you here. My name is Stanley Goldfarb, and I am the chairman of Do No Harm. Do No Harm is a membership organization, and we now have 17,000 members. These include physicians, nurses, and concerned patients. I'd like to thank FMMA for this invitation and for the opportunity to speak with you about the work of Do No Harm to eliminate discriminatory practices in healthcare, to restore meritocracy in the selection of medical practitioners, and to prevent any further harm to children with gender dysphoria in the name of so-called gender-affirming care. While the cost of healthcare is a crucial issue for our country and a driver of much of the activity in academic medical centers, a problem well discussed at this meeting, there is also a moral imperative which should concern these powerful institutions, these academic medical centers, as well as all of us. Virtually all academic health centers have adopted the concept that they are hotbeds of racism, and that in order to achieve better health outcomes for Black patients, the elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion must be injected into all aspects of medical care. We at Do No Harm believe this has been a terrible error in American healthcare and has created a real risk for undermining the quality of that healthcare. I know that Franklin Roosevelt's famous call for achieving 4 freedoms for America is viewed as an early manifestation of a socialist agenda. Everyone know about the 4 freedoms? We're in a different era. Well, I'll tell you about them. But Roosevelt had a genius for distilling his ideas in phrases that were easily appreciated by the public. So the 4 freedoms he talked about in getting ready to combat the Nazi scourge in Europe was the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want. That's what has led to a view that it had a certain socialist characteristic to it, and the freedom from fear. That was probably the most famous one. He gave that famous statement that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And fear was a great problem at that point in America, and maybe it's returning now as well. In many ways, our nation essentially pursued these goals in World War II, and through the force of arms allowed much of the Western world to enjoy the benefits of these freedoms, although it required the benefits also of free markets and capitalism. I think we need to have a similar agenda for American medicine. I propose that we work to achieve the following 4 freedoms for the American people in the realm of healthcare. Our current government has made important overtures that suggest it supports the agenda I'm proposing. First, and I'm going to go through these freedoms and then elaborate on them. First, the freedom from substandard medical care. This freedom will require recruiting only the best and brightest individuals to become those who deliver health care to the American people. Merit must be the only criterion for that privilege. Next, the freedom from corruption of the scientific enterprise. Increasingly, medical science has devolved into an enterprise where political ideology holds as much sway as seeking the truth. NIH grant-making should not be the playground for politically driven research initiatives. Next, the freedom from gender ideology infecting medicine. We can be tolerant of adults' choices and lifestyles, while protecting children from increasing efforts to take advantage during childhood and adolescence of a period of self-doubt and confusion into a medicalized and even surgical approach to altering their physical appearance. And finally, we must guarantee the freedom from public health authoritarianism. If there are true heroes of this latter concept, of course it is the creators of the Great Barrington Declaration, including Dr. J. Bhattacharya, who's now the head of the NIH, who fought against a horrific set of public health orthodoxies during the pandemic, even when clinical data showed them to be inimical to the health of the American people. We must create mechanisms to prevent any such recurrence. This is a big list, and one that requires partnerships between healthcare authorities, practicing physicians, academic medical centers, and perhaps most of all, professional societies that have been guilty of many of the problems that the freedom agenda needs to correct. It certainly is not a cure-all for all the problems of our healthcare system, but it will go a long way to reestablishing trust in the system, a trust that is now very, very weak. Regarding the first freedom, the freedom from substandard care, we must recruit the best and brightest into medicine. There are compelling data that this is currently not the case. A 2023 study by Hansen et al. In the journal Academic Medicine showed that MedCat scores, the achievement test for medical school, generally predicts student outcomes. Those with lower scores fare worse over their 4 years in the classroom, and the strong correlation between MCAT scores and student success holds across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic lines. Yet, we know from information supplied by the Association of American Medical Colleges that a minority applicant with below average achievement test scores and undergraduate grades has an 85% chance of being accepted into medical school, whereas an Asian applicant with those scores has less than a 15% chance. Now, this is not to say, and I'll repeat this point, that there aren't incredibly talented minority students who are in medical school now, but as a group, some are being admitted because of racial issues rather than because they have achieved the same level as others who are being denied. And remember that there are 55,000 students who apply to medical school, and there are 22,000 openings. So if someone becomes a physician, someone else didn't get that chance. So this is a fairness question as well. We also know that minority applicants as a group, including those with below average academic achievements, are performing less well as residents. And again, doesn't mean that there aren't incredibly talented individuals in the group, but that's how group performance is going. This is unsurprising if the same groups performed less well as medical students. There is a large study of internal medicine trainees published in the journal Academic Medicine in 2023. The data consisted of 3,600 evaluations of 703 residents by over 600 faculty members at 6 internal medicine residency training programs in the U.S. Emory, Mass General, University of Alabama at Birmingham, University of California, San Francisco, University of Chicago, and University of Louisville, all top programs. On average, URIM, so-called underrepresented medicine residents, that is, residents who are neither white nor Asian, scored lower on measures of medical knowledge, medical practice, professionalism, practice-based learning, and improvement and interpersonal and communication skills. Again, that's not to say there weren't outstanding individuals in that cohort, but as a group, the cohort performed less well. A 2023 study in JAMA Network of 634 assessments of over 2,700 emergency medicine residents in over 120 ACGME accredited programs found that underrepresented in medicine male and female residents were again rated significantly lower by their faculty compared to the other groups in all 6 competencies: patient care, medical knowledge, etc. Again, while in no doubt in each study there were outstanding minority trainees, but others of the group dragged down their peers and produced the disappointing results. For those who say that such individuals with below average academic achievements are good enough because they pass licensure exam, it is a question which students have the opportunity to practice invasive cardiology or neurosurgery or other highly demanding technical and intellectual pursuits. Again, it also means that other more highly qualified individuals for their academic work, for example, the Asians who were denied admission to Harvard, never become physicians because there simply are insufficient training opportunities or admission openings in medical schools to accommodate all those who seek to become physicians. The other terrible problem with this approach is that those minority trainees, students who have performed exceptionally well, are often denied credit for their achievements because they're viewed as having been admitted based on these racial characteristics. So it undermines the achievements that individuals are able to achieve in in the goal of producing some sort of group-based outcome. We must be vigilant in preventing the DEI agenda from undermining the quality of American medicine. Do No Harm has pursued a legislative and litigation strategy to achieve that end. We have been involved in legislation now passed in 26 states, as well as in multiple lawsuits against healthcare organizations that have promoted the DEI agenda. Next, I want to talk about the freedom from the corruption of the scientific enterprise. Let me give you but one example of the corruption of science in the name of DEI. In August 2020, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, it's a very prestigious journal, published an influential academic paper with a striking empirical finding. Using data from Florida hospitals over 3 decades, the study found that Black babies were less likely to die if cared for by Black physicians instead of white physicians after birth. The article created a stir, unsurprising given the importance of the topic and the findings' ramifications for patients' choices, for hospital practices, and for the debate over affirmative action. Media outlets, including The Washington Post and CNN, covered the paper. In 2023, drawing from an amicus brief filed by the Association of American Medical Colleges, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson cited the finding in her dissent in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, which addressed the legality of racial preferences in higher education. But the study was wrong. Controlling for very low birth weight, i.e. comparing newborns within the same weight class, eliminates the racial concordance result in the most detailed statistical models. This happens because Black doctors disproportionately care for Black newborns with healthy birth weights. Conversely, white doctors care for a disproportionately large share of the Black babies most at risk, those who have a very low birth weight. What's most distressing in this case is that a Freedom of Information Act request by our organization revealed that in emails between the authors of that study, they knew very well that this was the case, but in fact had decided to suppress that part of the data and to suppress other data that showed that white babies fared less well if they were cared for by Black doctors. Their rationale for suppressing these data is that they had a narrative that they were interested in. The narrative was that, and they were seeking this as an outcome, they thought that it was important that Black babies have Black doctors. But in fact, their data undermined this, and this was a knowing subterfuge that really is quite disturbing to have happened. This sort of corruption of the scientific enterprise must stop. Our organization has an extensive research effort that seeks to debunk this information, and it was through Ian Kingsbury's efforts that the subterfuge was uncovered. We are devoted to this sort of effort to clarify for the public when the scientific literature is biased and views the world through the lens of critical race theory in order to prove this issue of racism as underlying the approach to the care of minority patients. In a document published on our website, Kingsbury and Jay Green, 2 researchers who are part of the Do No Harm team, have reviewed the data about the benefits of racial concordance in healthcare in general, and have shown that there are 5 systematic reviews comprising over 60 publications, which show that there is no evidence that Black patients benefit with better health outcomes or better health communications if they are treated by a Black physician. There is no room in American healthcare for racial segregation. We will continue to perform and to publish this sort of research to combat the groupthink that has permeated our scientific enterprise. The next freedom that we propose is the freedom from gender ideology infecting medicine. Do No Harm is committed to ensuring that the practice of medicine is driven by scientific evidence rather than ideology. In recent years, the practice of biology-denying interventions, euphemistically known as gender-affirming care, has become more common despite the serious harm caused by those medical interventions and the complete lack of reliable evidence of any benefit for minors. Indeed, Do No Harm has recently released a database demonstrating that nearly 14,000 minors were subjected to biology-denying interventions in the United States between 2019 and 2023. To date, every systematic review, and there have been many, has concluded that no reliable evidence shows that gender-affirming medical interventions can help resolve gender dysphoria. Several domestic and international institutions, including health authorities in Finland, Florida, Sweden, and the UK, have conducted systematic reviews of the evidence justifying the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or surgeries as a treatment for minors with gender dysphoria. Each one has concluded that the evidence supporting such medical intervention is either insufficient or non-existent. At bottom, each of these systematic reviews found that evidence justifying the use of medical intervention as a treatment for gender dysphoria in minors is completely lacking. Given this lack of evidence, it is entirely appropriate to exclude sex trait modification for the purposes of treating gender dysphoria as an essential health benefit, and it should not be covered by insurance companies. We are pursuing litigation throughout the country in order to eliminate this scourge from American medicine. We have sponsored legislation in 27 states to that end. Finally, the freedom from coercive public health practices. This is a new initiative for Do No Harm. We feel this is an important issue for America, and we feel that our experience in producing policy positions and in interacting with governmental bodies may allow us to make a real contribution in this arena. During the COVID pandemic, public health authoritarianism was in full display. Many public health leaders had great conflicts of interest, as outlined this morning by Dr. Smith in his talk. There continues to be many physicians and groups that are producing re-examinations of the way our country responded to the pandemic, including understanding the risk of various vaccination strategies as well as the need for social isolation. Our organization feels that a focus must be placed on what we will do to protect the public in future pandemics. And specifically, how will decisions be made to determine the proper cost for keeping the population safe? Now, it is facile to say that we will never need to have an emergency vaccine or to have some sort of required social isolation. There are illnesses that really do require that. But it is conceivable that such measures may be necessary. The problem in the past was once it became clear that social isolation was a terrible error and that vaccines were not preventing the spread of the virus, our public health officials did not question their decisions or their approaches, but rather doubled down on many of their failed assessments. This must not happen again. We must have an oversight mechanism that is independent from those who are making the initial decisions. This oversight mechanism must report to the public, must be responsible to the public, and must be free of any conflicts of interest that might cloud their best judgment. Do No Harm is now working to generate these new policies, which must be put in place so the public's trust in the response to future pandemics and other public health emergencies can be restored. So that is our freedom agenda for medicine. It's not complete, but it is necessary, and we will be relentless in pursuing it. So I thank you for your attention. I know we have a few minutes for questions, and I'm happy to take any questions at this time. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And one that I feel very strongly about, actually. You know, I spent 13 years as the Associate Dean for Curriculum at Penn's Medical School. That was my career. And one of the things that disturbed me the most was that it was really hard to get the students to learn how to read a scientific paper and how to understand the statistical methods. Now, I must tell you that the statistical methodologies have become very, very complicated. And most of the studies have required statistical consultants. So the people who are writing the study, who are authoring the studies or performing the experiments, usually have a whole office of statisticians who are producing a model that most of us couldn't possibly be familiar with unless we had graduate training in statistics. So that'll be a hard part. But what you can understand and what we can teach medical students much better is experimental design and the pitfalls and the problems associated with experimental design. So I wish we had the courses in biostatistics and epidemiology that weren't a week long, which is often the case in most schools, and you get a sort of a smattering of how to read a scientific paper, and that's it. And then off you go to learn how to be a doctor. Whereas that is what you need to learn, particularly in this modern age where physicians are, yeah, they're both caring and empathetic individuals, but they're also managers of tremendous amounts of information, and they need how to learn to manage that. Will AI solve the problem? I don't think so. I mean, any of us who have played with it, it's helpful, but it's not going to answer the question. But here's what I would advise. I would advise when you read a paper that you think is important, that look at the introduction and look at the conclusions, particularly. And when they make statements in there where they're explaining the rationale for doing the study, look up some of the references that they use. Often they haven't read those papers that they cite as affording the basis for doing their study. And often they haven't read the papers that they cite as justifying the conclusions they've made. So if you do that work, you will get very far in understanding whether this paper is valid or not. And then in terms of looking at the results, of course, you have to look at the results. That's the point of reading the paper. But again, with that in mind, if someone says, for example, and one example that I've written about is a paper that showed that, this is sort of a long answer to a good question, but a paper that showed that minority children weren't getting their blood sugars well managed. I went back 3 levels of references to find out that their assumption that the reason their blood sugar levels weren't well managed was they claimed it was because of racism on the part of the physicians. When you get to the paper where they referenced that made this claim, it turns out that it was based on a survey that was done of physicians who gave out insulin pumps, and that was really the issue, whether the kids got an insulin pump or not. And they denied that it had anything to do with race. What it had to do with was in the insurance plan, because more of the Black kids' families were on Medicaid, and Medicaid put a terrible burden on families in order to document that they were measuring the blood sugar frequently enough to use an insulin pump. So the reason that if they didn't document blood sugars 3 times a day, and it might be a woman who's working 2 jobs, had 3 kids, a single mom, she couldn't do this. So it was a burden that they couldn't handle, and the physicians understood this, and that's why they didn't try to recommend an insulin pump, because they knew it would get taken away. Yet they blamed that phenomenon on racism, when it represented a socioeconomic condition that really wasn't under the physician's control. So the answer wasn't send the physician to the implicit bias training. The answer was come up with a better way of asking these families to be able to document this, and that would have solved the problem. So again, those are some of the issues that I would say to you. But I wish medical schools, and I wish medical students were more willing to take a more in-depth course in biostatistics and epidemiology. Often they aren't. So very good question, though. Yeah, please. I've been asked that question a lot. And again, it's a really good question. The answer has changed a little bit. When I was asked this, the first time was about 2.5 years ago. Do No Harm's been in business for 3 years now. This is almost an anniversary for us. When I was asked that question, it was on a webinar from Canada, and a student asked me this, and my advice was keep your mouth shut. You're going to get destroyed if you start questioning anything. And it was more about DEI than it was about the gender stuff. Here we are 3 years later, and it's quite clear that society has examined this, and many physicians have examined this, and there are medical students who have spoken out and have been, successful. The question is, do you have the data in your hand? Do you know what you're talking about? Can you point to references? Can you say, look, What do you think of the cast review, for example, that was done in England? I urge you to read that, because if you read it, then your professor says to you, why are you saying this? Say, look, here's the data from England. Here's the data from cast review. Cass was the chief pediatrician in England. She was deputized to do this by the National Health Service, and she came up with a conclusion. So in this day and age, puberty blockers are not used in Britain, and sex hormones and other treatments are only given under very rare circumstances. The other thing I would suggest is that you demonstrate this sort of empathy and kindness about this condition. That's really important. I mean, there are adults who were transgender individuals who were quite happy with their lives. It's not for me, it's not for you, it's not for anybody to tell them how to live, as far as I'm concerned. But children are different. And the argument to be made is that, children often their parents are often coerced into giving consent. Consent is always given by the parents and children. But when the parents are told your child might commit suicide if you don't do this, you have to go down this path. If you know the data about that and then point out, look, professor, whoever, here are the data. There are 2 studies from England that show very clearly that there's no increased risk of suicide. In fact, in the largest trial that was done in the United States, and that has been ongoing in its studies and published in the New England Journal, 2 of the people in the study committed suicide that were getting gender-affirming care, so-called gender-affirming care. So my answer to you is be brave, but have the data in hand. Know what you're talking about. It shouldn't be an ideology that you're presenting, but rather a set of data that asks your professors to argue the data rather than to argue the concepts. Yes, sir. Yeah. But be brave. You'll find out that you have allies, and the truth is, it's unlikely you're really going to be hurt if you speak up in a respectful, again, which is what you just heard as well, a respectful, a kind, and a data-based question, as well as any answers that you're asked to give. Yes. It's very hard to measure quality. Medicine has failed at this. Part of the reason for that is so much of the outcomes are based on what the patient brings to the encounter rather than what the physician does. The physicians, have an important role, but also the rest of the healthcare team, the nurses, the hospital, the quality of the pathologist, the quality of the blood bank, and on and on and on, all contributes to outcomes in serious illnesses. But here's what we do know. So there are 2 large studies that have recently been published. One looked at the results of individuals' exam success on the American Board of Internal Medicine certifying exam in internal medicine, and how well their patients did. The better you did on those exams, the better outcomes your patients had. And they were able to match databases in order to come to this better outcomes with respect to mortality and better outcomes with respect to readmission to the hospital. Most of these people were hospitalists, so that was what they were really measuring, how well they did. And then there's also another study that was done of the results of the licensure exam, which, used to have a numerical score, and now is pass-fail. But that, too, correlated in the same way with how patients did in the state of Pennsylvania. That's where the study was conducted. So we don't really have the data that you're asking about. But all we know is that as you follow individuals through the path of training and then now into starting to practice medicine, we have that sort of evidence. And that's about the best we can do. I think that, there's no question that, I've said that I think medicine to a great extent is a very academic pursuit, right? I mean, you're standing there, you're encountering a patient, you have to keep a lot of information in your head. You have to be able to sort through what the patient is telling you. You have to be able to bring up the sort of background information that allows you to care for that patient. That's the sort of thing that exams test. And that's what real patient care to a certain extent is like. Obviously, there's the empathy and there's the understanding the patient's predicaments and all that. It's critically important as well. But I think, I used to tell the students that in the first year and a half, 2 years of medical school, we give them a multiple choice test. We give them the STEM, right? The little story that we'd ask a question about. Then they have 5 choices, and they'd have to pick the right one. Once you get out in the clinics, it turns around. You are writing the STEM, and you are creating the 5 choices in your head. And that's the way, that's an aspect of that patient-physician interaction. People who are better at that are going to be better at caring for their patients. Again, it's hard to measure the differences, but it's the old story. If you had a family member, would you want them to deal with someone that really struggled through medical school and residency, be the one who's providing them the care? That's a good question, and we're going to see, aren't we? But that's, up until now, of course, they've been under supervision, but now they're being given more and more independence. The problem there is that some of them are fabulous, right? Some of them are terrific and are really quite capable, but the training is much less. And will ultimately that play down into a different set of healthcare outcomes? Maybe. The critical thing is that they themselves understand what they're capable of doing and be able to, incorporate that into the way they deal with patients. But it's a very good question. I think the key to this is to understand that this isn't about giving people an opportunity to be a doctor. This is about providing the best patient care. So the key is, what's the best thing for the patient, not what's the best thing for the student. Now, I think in undergraduate years, I think there's an argument for making sure that you have a diverse class. There is a good argument. People should interact with other people and they should learn. But medical school, they're beyond it now. You're pretty much adults at that point. You've been to college. You've been at this point, to say, well, we need to have diversity for diversity's sake. What you need to show is that diversity has a benefit for patients. If you can't show that, then that should not be a value. And that's my argument. And the fact that racial concordance doesn't provide a benefit, and the fact that you undermine the achievements of Black doctors by saying that, well, we're going to take in a bunch of people who are less qualified than these people, but we want to do it because we believe in diversity as a goal in and of itself. Or you feel that there's a need for reparations. Now, many people feel that way. They feel like there was denial of opportunity for so many years. It started during the period that Blacks in America were enslaved, and it persisted for many years after that. And there are others that feel this is the basis for doing this. And okay, I think that's sort of a more honest basis for making this, as opposed to making up benefits of it that have to do with patient care, because those benefits don't exist. Well, you try to find a qualified Black male or Black woman who applies to medical school has been rejected. You find one for me. Let me know when you find one, because that's not what's happening. Yeah, anybody is, if they're qualified, and I think that makes sense. If you had 2 people that are equally qualified, take the one that had less opportunity. Absolutely. But don't take one who's much less qualified. Well, but that's what's happening. Yes. I think we've taken too much of your time. So thank you very much for coming. And I think the students are going to stay, and we'll have a chance to chat a little bit more. But thank you very much.